The hedgerows were closing in. Thick walls of earth and tangled roots turned every field into a fortress. The air hung heavy with gunpowder and the distant stutter of machine guns. Inside the cramped steel belly of an American M4 Sherman, 5 men breathed in rhythm with the engine's roar, a mechanical heartbeat echoing beneath their boots. Sweat ran down their faces, mixing with the smell of oil and fear. The radio crackled, a faint voice from command. Then static. Panzer, heavy, right flank. Silence. The gunner tightened his grip on the traverse wheel. The commander peered through the periscope, scanning the tree line. Then came a sound that froze the blood of every Allied tanker, the deep, deliberate growl of an 88mm cannon being loaded. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a Tiger was waiting. The next voice on the radio would not be a report. It would be a farewell, one that still echoes in the archives of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. By the time the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the war had entered a new phase, one defined by machines, momentum, and mastery of logistics. The tide had turned. The Red Army pressed from the east. Anglo-American bombers darkened the skies over Germany, but the Western Front, the long-awaited invasion of Hitler's fortress Europe, was yet to be opened. For the U.S. Army, armored warfare was the backbone of that opening strike. Thousands of M4 Shermans were shipped across the Atlantic, each a symbol of American industry, reliable, fast, easy to repair. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank in the world, far from it, but it was available in numbers that no other army could match. Across the Channel, the German Wehrmacht prepared for the inevitable. Among their armored divisions lay a weapon that inspired both awe and terror, the Panzer Kampfwagen 6 Tiger. Weighing nearly 57 tons, its armor was thick enough to deflect most Allied rounds, and its 80 K-36 gun could destroy a Sherman before the American crew even saw where the shot came from. In the early months of 1944, Allied intelligence was well aware of these Tigers. Reports from the Eastern Front had already painted them as invincible beasts. Soviet tankers nicknamed them Königstiger, the king of the battlefield. When German heavy armor appeared in Tunisia in 1943, British and American crews quickly learned that frontal engagements were suicidal. Still, the U.S. armored doctrine did not change. Mobility and numbers, not brute armor, would win the day. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied troops broke through the beaches of Normandy, tanks followed. Shermans landed on the sand under relentless fire, their tracks struggling for grip, many burned before reaching solid ground. Yet once inland, the rolling Bocage countryside became their true test, a nightmare of narrow lanes, ambush points, and short sight lines. This terrain favored the defenders, especially the German tankers. Who knew every hedgerow could hide an enemy? The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and elements of the elite Panzerlehr brought with them a handful of Tiger Eyes and the even more formidable Tiger IIs. They were few, but they were devastating. One Tiger in the right position could hold off entire columns of Shermans. The Allies compensated with overwhelming air power and artillery. Yet in the chaos of Normandy, weather and terrain often neutralized those advantages. Tank versus tank engagements became brutally close, a matter of seconds and nerve. American tank crews soon developed grim humor about their odds. If we see the Tiger first, we might live. Inside each Sherman, 5 men worked as one: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Theirs was a small world of steel, noise, and sweat, where every order had to be followed instantly or death followed instead. The Germans, by contrast, had fewer crews but better machines and seasoned veterans, many drawn from the Eastern Front, where they had learned to kill T-34s by the dozens. By July 1944, as U.S. forces pushed toward the strategic town of St. Lo, tank battles erupted daily across the hedgerows. The 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division Spearhead, and the 4th Armored Division all clashed with German Tigers near towns like Villers-Bocage, Marigny, and Le Désert. Each encounter left wrecks smoldering in the fields, Sherman after Sherman, steel coffins marking the slow progress of liberation. But the Americans learned fast. New tactics emerged, flanking maneuvers, smoke screens, and calling in fighter bombers to destroy Tigers from above. The introduction of the M4A176W, with its longer 76mm gun, gave crews a fighting chance at closer ranges. Still, the psychological shadow of the Tiger loomed large. It was more than a tank. It was a myth, a weapon that shaped fear itself. As one veteran recalled, "You didn't fight tigers. You survived them." And in one such encounter deep in the bocage of Normandy, a U.S. crew would meet their fate face-to-face with the German machine. The last words they sent over the radio would capture not only their courage, but the sheer imbalance of the battlefield. Their transmission, short, desperate, and real, would survive the war as a haunting echo of what it meant to face a tiger. They were young, almost all of them. Most Sherman tankers in 1944 were in their early 20s, some barely out of high school. Recruited from small towns and cities across America, they had trained in the vast open spaces of Kansas, California, and Texas, firing shells across empty ranges that could never prepare them for the hedgerows of Normandy. Their world was the tank. The Sherman was not just a machine. It was home fortress and coffin combined. The interior was cramped, lit by the dim orange of control lamps. The walls were lined with ammunition racks, 75mm shells stacked like silent promises. The engine behind them, a Continental Radial or Ford V8, filled the space with heat and vibration. Crewmen learned to move like parts of a living organism. The driver controlled the heart, clutch, brake, throttle, all by feel. The gunner was the eyes and the nerve, his hand steady on the elevation wheel. The loader lived in motion, grab shell, insert, shout, up. The commander alone saw the bigger picture, peering through his periscope, speaking through his throat microphone into the radio that linked their tiny world to the chaos outside. When they first arrived in Normandy, many tankers believed the Sherman was a good tank. In North Africa and Italy, it had been reliable and deadly against the older German models, the Panzer III and a IV. But here, in France, they met something different. The first time a Tiger appeared on the horizon, its presence was unmistakable. Even before seeing it, the men could hear it. That slow, mechanical growl, deeper and heavier than any Sherman's engine. The ground itself seemed to vibrate as the Tiger moved. Then came its silhouette, flat turret, vertical armor, massive gun, like a moving bunker. At typical engagement ranges of 800 to 1,000 meters, a Sherman's 75mm shell would simply bounce off the Tiger's armor. In contrast, the Tiger's 80mm gun could destroy a Sherman at more than twice that distance. One shot, one explosion, one less crew, the U.S. Army tried to reassure its men. Commanders emphasized mobility and teamwork. Shermans should attack in groups, flanking the enemy, calling in airstrikes if possible. But to the crews inside the tanks, that sounded like theory. And theory didn't stop a shell traveling 2,800 feet per second. Letters home spoke little of fear. Most crews didn't want to worry their families. They wrote about French villages, rations, the weather. Only rarely did someone mention the big cats, like the tigers and panthers, that haunted the countryside. Yet among themselves, over campfires and mess tents, they spoke of them constantly. Tankers developed rituals for luck, a coin in the pocket, a photo taped to the turret wall, a prayer before starting the engine. They nicknamed their tanks Lucky Lady, Hell's Bell, Thunderbolt, or Sweet Adeline. It gave steel a human soul, something to fight for, and something to mourn when it burned. The German tankers were different. Older, often veterans hardened by years on the Eastern Front. Many were part of elite SS or Wehrmacht heavy battalions. They trusted their machines as much as their instincts. For them, a Tiger was not just armor. It was supremacy, a weapon to restore control in a war that was slipping away. Still, even for them, the pressure was immense. Fuel shortages, relentless air attacks, and overwhelming Allied numbers made every engagement a desperate calculation. The Tiger's might came with limitations. It was slow, mechanically fragile, and needed constant maintenance. But when it worked, it ruled the battlefield. For the Americans, survival depended on speed and communication. The radio was their lifeline. Every order, every warning, every plea for help traveled through that fragile network of static and code words. Tankers slept beside their headsets, their voices hoarse from calling coordinates. The sound of radio chatter became as familiar as breathing, until sometimes it ended mid-sentence. By late July 1944, As the Allies pushed beyond St. Lo toward Operation Cobra, encounters with Tigers became less frequent but no less deadly. The Americans had learned to avoid frontal duels, to use terrain and teamwork. But sometimes, in the wrong field, at the wrong moment, a single tank crew found themselves alone. And one of those crews, deep in the bocage near Le Désert, would make a final radio call that still survives in the archives. A call that captured the fear, the courage, and the cold mechanical finality of armored warfare. That moment, that brief, broken transmission, would soon define what it meant to face the invincible Tiger. The machine defines the doctrine. In 1944, the clash between the Sherman and the Tiger was more than a battle of armor. It was a collision of philosophies. The United States built tanks to serve strategy. Germany built strategy to serve its tanks. The M4 Sherman was designed for mobility, mass production, and reliability. It was not meant to duel heavy tanks. It was meant to win wars through logistics and maneuver. Each Sherman could be built in days, shipped across oceans, repaired in the field, and replaced by the thousands. Its 75mm gun, while modest, could penetrate medium armor and provide infantry support, the true mission of U.S. armored forces. The philosophy behind it was simple. Quantity has a quality of its own. The Tiger Warrior, by contrast, embodied the German obsession with engineering perfection. Each one was handcrafted, over 1,300 precision parts, 60 tons of steel, built in small numbers under the supervision of master machinists. It was a masterpiece, and a logistical nightmare. Its Maybach engine strained under its weight, transmissions failed often, and it consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate. But on the battlefield it was unmatched. Its 88mm Cub K-36 L-56 gun, adapted from the famous flak anti-aircraft weapon, could destroy any Allied tank before the enemy even entered effective range. The contrast was visible from the moment the two machines faced each other. A Sherman's armor was sloped, 50mm thick at the front, to deflect incoming rounds. The Tiger's was flat but over 100mm thick, dense and nearly impervious to Allied shells. A Tiger crew could sit in cover and pick off enemy tanks methodically, while Sherman crews had to rely on flanking maneuvers, speed and coordination to survive. For U.S. tankers, tactics were everything. A single Sherman could not take a Tiger head-on, but 5 working together could outmaneuver it, one drawing fire, others circling to the flanks. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it meant loss. The first 2 tanks might burn before the others got a clear shot at the Tiger's thinner side armor. The Americans called it the numbers game. For every Tiger destroyed, several Shermans were lost. U.S. doctrine reflected this pragmatism. Tanks were not tank hunters. That was the job of tank destroyers, vehicles like the M10 Wolverine or the M18 Hellcat, equipped with high-velocity guns. Shermans were designed to exploit breakthroughs, not create them. But Normandy blurred those lines. The bocage was too confined, the front lines too fluid. Tank destroyers couldn't always arrive in time. So Sherman crews found themselves fighting Tigers, not by design but by circumstance. The Germans, meanwhile, fought under a different creed. A Tiger was not a support weapon, it was the spearhead. Heavy tank battalions, or Schwer Panzerabteilungen, operated in small numbers but with immense impact. Each Tiger platoon could halt entire Allied advances. Their commanders, men like Michael Wittmann, the Tiger ace of Villers-Bocage, became legends. In June 1944, Wittmann's single Tiger ambushed a British column, destroying over a dozen vehicles in minutes before retreating. The story spread like wildfire across both sides of the front. To Allied soldiers, the Tiger became a symbol of near-supernatural lethality. But for all its power, the Tiger's weaknesses were severe. It was slow, barely 24 miles per hour on open ground, less in the mud of Normandy. Its mechanical failures were constant. Maintenance required skilled crews and supply lines that the crumbling Reich could no longer sustain. Many Tigers were abandoned not in battle, but because they ran out of fuel or broke down under their own weight. The Sherman, by contrast, was a soldier's tank, predictable, forgiving, and alive. Crews loved it for one thing: it worked. It started in the cold, it crossed bridges that would collapse under a Tiger, and it could be repaired with spare parts scavenged from the next field over. In a long war of movement, that reliability mattered more than raw firepower. And yet, when the moment came to fight, no amount of reliability could shield a Sherman from the shock of an 88mm shell. The difference in doctrine created an asymmetry in emotion as well as tactics. German tankers went to battle knowing they were feared. American tankers went to battle knowing they were outgunned, but had to fight anyway. That psychological gap shaped every engagement. For German crews, confidence came from steel. For Americans, from each other. Inside the Sherman, camaraderie was armor. Invisible, but often stronger than steel. Every time a Tiger was sighted, the same ritual followed. The commander shouted coordinates, the gunner whispered a range estimate, the loader braced, the driver revved. The sound inside was deafening. Commands, metal, heartbeats, until the first explosion ripped through. Sometimes it was theirs, sometimes not. In those seconds, the entire war compressed into one question: who sees who first? That equation, sight, reaction, and survival, defined tank warfare in 1944. And nowhere was that equation more brutally tested than in the hedgerows of Normandy, where American courage met German precision in a duel of inches and seconds. Men inside the metal, behind every tank. There was always a man with a voice on the radio, and behind that voice, there was always fear. The U.S. Army's armored divisions were built on teamwork. Every engagement relied on communication, coordination, and trust between dozens of crews. But when facing the Tiger, those principles were tested to their breaking point. The American tank commander, perched in his small, rotating cupola, carried a responsibility few could imagine. His job was not only to find and destroy the enemy, but to keep his men alive. He had seconds to read the battlefield, interpret radio orders, and choose whether to advance or withdraw. One wrong call, and 4 lives would vanish in a fireball of steel and gasoline. Many commanders spoke later of the same nightmare, hearing the hiss of an incoming shell, a sound that rose in pitch until it ended in white silence. That sound meant the Tiger had seen you first. Leadership in the fog. At higher levels of command, fear was replaced by frustration. Allied leaders like General Omar Bradley and George S. Patton were well aware of the Tiger's dominance. Reports from the front repeatedly described Shermans being destroyed at long range, entire platoons wiped out before getting close enough to return fire. Yet doctrine forbade hesitation. Armored units had to push forward regardless of losses, to maintain the momentum of the advance. Bradley once wrote that the American soldier's greatest advantage was his belief that he could win. That belief, he knew, was fragile. In the bocage of Normandy, morale was often held together by sheer willpower and the promise that every sacrifice pushed Hitler's Reich one field closer to defeat. For Patton, tank warfare was a matter of aggression, speed over fear. A good plan violently executed now, he told his officers, is better than a perfect plan next week. Patton's divisions learned to move fast, hit hard, and never stop long enough for the Tigers to line up their perfect shots. It was effective, but it came at a price. Burned-out Shermans littering the advance routes like steel tombstones. Meanwhile, across the hedgerows, German officers faced their own nightmare. Their once proud armored forces were being swallowed by the overwhelming tide of Allied production. For every Tiger they fielded, the Americans could deploy dozens of Shermans. For every German tanker lost, there were fewer replacements. Commanders like Major Otto Carius, a decorated Tiger ace on the eastern and western fronts, understood the burden of being both hunter and hunted. In his memoirs, Carius described the constant tension between technical superiority and human vulnerability. A Tiger was not invincible, he wrote. It was only as strong as its weakest man when fear could make any man weak. The weight of fear. Fear was universal, but it manifested differently. For German crews, it came from above, the ceaseless roar of Allied fighter bombers. Jebos, they called them. Thunderbolts and Typhoons diving with rockets and machine guns. A single sighting could destroy a Tiger column. Crews learned to hide during the day, moving only at dusk, engines muffled, hatches sealed. For Americans, fear came from ahead. The knowledge that somewhere beyond the next hedgerow, a Tiger might be waiting, invisible until it fired. Every rustle in the brush could be the metallic clank of a turret turning. Every puff of dust could be a muzzle flash. Inside the tank, fear took on its own rhythm. Crews smoked constantly, talked in code, cracked dark jokes. A Sherman crew's bond was deeper than friendship. It was a survival pact. They knew each other's habits, tempers, even breathing patterns. A glance was enough to communicate life or death choices. When one tank was hit, others often drove toward the wreck, trying to rescue survivors even under fire. Many died that way. The act was reckless yet profoundly human. They couldn't leave a brother burning inside a steel coffin. Command under fire. Leadership inside a tank was not about orders. It was about trust. A good commander listened. A great one knew when not to speak. Every second of radio silence could mean the difference between stealth and detection. But sometimes, silence broke, and with a scream, a warning, or a call for help that cut through the static. One recorded fragment from the Normandy campaign, preserved in Signal Corps archives, captures such a moment. The voice of an American tanker, calm but strained. Tiger. Tiger at 2 o'clock. Range 800. We're hit! Then nothing. Just static. The voice has never been identified, but its echo remains. It speaks not of defeat or bravery, but of reality. The brief moment when man and machine collide with fate. Psychology of command. Both sides learned that morale was as decisive as steel. The Germans used the Tiger's reputation as psychological warfare. Allied intelligence reports noted that even rumors of Tiger presence could stall an advance. Entire battalions would proceed cautiously, burning precious daylight simply because one tank, sometimes just one, might be ahead. But American resolve hardened in response. By the late summer of 1944, tankers had developed counter-beliefs, stories of Shermans that destroyed Tigers through teamwork, luck, or sheer determination. Whether true or not, these tales spread like medicine. They reminded soldiers that the Tiger could bleed. And when the first Tigers were finally found abandoned, engines seized, tracks blown, crews would climb atop them, take photographs, and scrawl chalk messages. You weren't so tough after all. It was symbolic defiance, proof that fear could be beaten, even if victory came through attrition rather than supremacy. The human balance. At its core, the confrontation between the Sherman and the Tiger was not about steel. It was about men, engineers, commanders, loaders, drivers, each bound by duty and circumstance. Both sides fought with conviction. Both paid in blood. The Tiger gave its crew confidence but also isolation, the sense of being both invincible and alone. The Sherman gave its crew vulnerability but also unity, a bond no armor could replicate. And when those two worlds met, as they would soon in a quiet Norman field, the result was not just a clash of tanks, but a collision of human endurance against technological might. That moment, when courage met inevitability, is where our story turns next. The field, near Le Désert, July 29th, 1944. The morning began with mist and thunder, not from the sky, from engines. At dawn, the U.S. 3rd Armored Division was advancing south of St. Lo, part of Operation Cobra, the great breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. The objective? To pierce the German lines and open the road to Avranches. But what lay between the Americans and open ground was a scattered force of Panzer Lehr Division, supported by a handful of Tigers from Schwerpanzerabteilung 503. The landscape was deceiving, soft fields bordered by thick green walls of hedgerow. The perfect trap. The Sherman column rolled forward in single file, engines rumbling, each tank keeping 20 yards of distance. Dust rose hanging in the humid air. Inside one of those Shermans, call sign Charlie White 2, 5 men stared through their slits of vision. Sergeant Paul Jenkins commanding, Corporal Jim Red Henley on the gun, Private Cole loading, and the drivers, Owens and Parker, steady at their posts. They'd been in France for 6 weeks. This was not their first fight, but something about this sector felt wrong. Jenkins's radio buzzed. Charlie White 2, hold position. Recon spotted armor east of your sector. He looked through his periscope, nothing, just hedgerows and silence. He tapped the gunner's shoulder. Eyes right. Scan that tree line, then it came. Not a sight, but a sound. A deep metallic growl, low and steady, echoing off the hedgerows. A sound no tanker ever forgot. Tiger, Henley whispered. The invisible enemy. The first shot came from 900 meters. A flash, a thunderclap, and the lead Sherman, Charlie White 1, vanished in a column of flame. The explosion sucked the air out of every lung in the field. The Tiger had them bracketed before they even spotted its turret. Reverse. Smoke! Smoke out! Jenkins shouted into the radio. White phosphorus rounds hissed into the field, cloaking the road in dense gray fog. Engines roared as Shermans tried to maneuver. The Tiger fired again, another hit. This time the shell punched through a tank's side armor, igniting the ammunition racks. 2 knocked out, came the report. The Tiger, hull down behind a hedgerow embankment, was methodical. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Each round was placed with cold precision. The crew, veterans of Kursk and Kharkov, had done this many times before. Inside Jenkins' Sherman, tension became noise, shouted commands, grinding gears, the loader's arms slick with sweat. Range 800. He loaded! Up, fire! The Sherman's gun thundered. The 75mm shell struck the hedgerow, bursting into dust and smoke. No effect, another round. Another miss, switch to AP. Range 600. Up, fire! This time the shot hit metal. Sparks ricochet. The Tiger's armor shrugged it off. The counter-move Jenkins made a decision. He keyed the radio. Charlie White 2 flanking left. Cover us! The Sherman lurched into motion, crashing through the hedgerow. Branches scraped the hull. The gunner adjusted elevation, searching for a shot at the Tiger's flank. The field opened, flat, exposed, target front. Left turret, range 500. Up, fire! The round struck. A glancing hit on the turret ring, harmless, then the Tiger turned slowly, deliberately. Back up! Back up, Jenkins shouted, too late. The 88 fired. The shell tore through the Sherman's glacis plate. The blast ripped through the compartment. Sparks, fire, screaming metal. Parker, the driver, never moved again. The loader's hands were gone. Jenkins clawed for the radio, choking on smoke. This is Charlie White 2, Tiger at 2 o'clock, range 800. We're hit. We're static. That was the last transmission ever received from the crew of Charlie White 2. The recording, captured by the battalion's radio log, still exists in the Signal Corps archive, cut off mid-sentence, followed by open carrier noise for 21 seconds before the signal died. Silence in the field. When the smoke cleared, 3 Shermans were burning. The others withdrew under cover of artillery fire. The Tiger was gone, slipped away into the next hedgerow, its engine muffled. Hours later, infantry reached the wrecks. Charlie White 2 lay half in a ditch, hatch open, smoke curling from the engine deck. The inside was blackened, the ammunition cooked off. They found Jenkins slumped over the radio set, headset still on. His final transmission had been his last breath. The Tiger that destroyed them was identified days later. Tiger number 312, commanded by Lieutenant Otto Blas, 3rd Company, 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion, the same unit that would later fight outside Paris before retreating east. Its own crew was killed weeks later when Allied fighter bombers struck their column near Chartres. The battlefield had no victors that day. Only wreckage. Yet that single radio call, a few seconds of desperation, would be transcribed, studied, and archived. For historians, it became one of the few surviving real-time records of a tank crew's final moments under fire. For the men who heard it that morning, it became something else. A reminder that courage sometimes sounds like a broken voice in static. The war would move on, through France, Belgium, the Ardennes, but that moment in Normandy would remain frozen in time, preserved in paper and magnetic tape, whispering across generations. The Tiger had won that battle. But from the ashes of those Shermans, an army was learning, adapting, evolving, preparing to turn the tide with new weapons, new tactics, and an unbreakable will to endure. The lessons written in fire. The burning Shermans near Le Désert were not an isolated tragedy. They were a lesson, one written in oil and smoke across the hedgerows of Normandy. In the days that followed, commanders of the 3rd Armored Division studied the wrecks carefully. Engineers measured penetration marks, cataloged shell trajectories, and interviewed survivors. They concluded what every tanker already knew. At typical combat ranges, the standard 75mm gun could not defeat a Tiger head-on. But war rarely allows time for redesign. The American answer had to come from improvisation, not invention. tank crews began modifying their tactics on the spot. Instead of engaging from the open, Shermans used smoke rounds and artillery screens to mask their movement. They learned to exploit terrain, cresting ridgelines at an angle, firing only brief snapshots, and never lingering long enough for a Tiger to zero in. Commanders paired tank units with infantry and bazooka teams, creating small hunter groups designed to distract and flank heavy armor. The battlefield itself became a classroom. The Tiger's greatest weapon was not its gun, it was its legend. Reports of a single Tiger could paralyze entire battalions. The U.S. Army's intelligence branches even began to exaggerate Tiger losses deliberately, trying to erode that myth. Newspaper briefings and morale bulletins spoke of dozens destroyed, when in reality the numbers were often 2 or 3. Yet the truth mattered less than the belief, and belief was ammunition. By August 1944, as Operation Cobra broke the German lines and unleashed the Allied advance across France, the balance began to shift. The Tiger could kill, but it could not hold. Each engagement drained Germany's scarce fuel, tires, and transmissions. And when retreat came, the Tigers were left behind. Immobilized monuments to wasted engineering perfection. Technology answers back. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department was already working on a solution. In testing grounds back in England and the States, engineers had been outgunning the Sherman. The result was the M4A176W and M4A3E8 EZ8, both equipped with high-velocity 76mm guns, capable of penetrating a Tiger's side armor under the right conditions. These tanks began to arrive at the front in late July, just as the Normandy campaign reached its bloodiest days. To the men who had fought in the 75mm Shermans, the new gun felt like justice. It wasn't perfect, it still couldn't reliably pierce the Tiger's frontal armor, but it meant the duel was no longer hopeless. With armor-piercing HVAP rounds, an American gunner could now believe he stood a chance. In parallel, the M36 Jackson tank destroyer entered service with its powerful 90mm gun, finally an equal to the Tiger's 88. The battlefield was shifting from resignation to parity. Still, technology was only half the answer. The other half came from the sky. The U.S. Army Air Force's P-47 Thunderbolt and the RAF's Typhoon fighter bombers became the Tiger's greatest enemies. Strafing runs and rocket attacks shattered German heavy armor units that could not move quickly enough to hide. By late summer, Tigers were being destroyed not by tanks, but by pilots. The German tank ace Otto Carius later admitted, "It was not the Shermans that frightened us most, it was the Thunderbolts." A doctrine reborn. The U.S. Army took the lessons of Normandy and turned them into doctrine. Armored units learned to combine speed, communication, and overwhelming firepower rather than rely on head-to-head duels. The Combat Command System, pioneered by the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions, reorganized tanks, infantry, engineers, and artillery into flexible, fast-moving battle groups. These combined arms teams could adapt on the fly, encircle enemy armor, and call in airstrikes within minutes. What the Tiger had in power, the Americans now matched in coordination. This was the true turning point of 1944, not a single duel, but a transformation in mindset. The myth of invincibility surrounding the Tiger began to fade. For every destroyed Sherman, there were 10 more rolling off ships in Cherbourg. For every Tiger victory, Allied strategy moved another mile forward. By the time the Germans withdrew toward Falaise, the Tiger's dominance had become its burden. Mechanical breakdowns, lack of fuel, and relentless Allied pressure left many crews blowing up their own tanks to prevent capture. Some Tigers ran out of ammunition before they even reached the fight. The machine that once terrified armies now symbolized futility, power without endurance. Echoes of the transmission. In the Signal Corps' recordings, the final radio message from Sergeant Jenkins' crew remained preserved, a faint whisper of humanity amid the static. When analyzed after the war, engineers discovered a short delay between his last words and the loss of signal. The tank had likely burned for nearly 2 minutes before the radio went dead. That transmission was later played during a post-war training course at Fort Knox. The instructor used it to teach a simple truth: never underestimate what your enemy can see before you can. For the next generation of tankers, it became a grim lesson in the price of visibility. In a sense, the men of Charlie White 2 did not die in vain. Their loss, and hundreds like it, forced a revolution in armored warfare. The Sherman evolved. Doctrine adapted. By the time Allied forces reached Germany, they had turned fear into precision, the ability to find, flank, and finish the enemy with discipline rather than desperation. The shift of power, August 1944, marked the end of the Tiger's reign in the West. At Villers-Fossard, Vire, and Mortagne, American units began to win tank engagements not through superior firepower, but through combined action. The once dreaded Tiger terror became a fading echo. Crews still respected it, but they no longer froze at its name. By the time the breakout reached the Falaise pocket, the Tigers that once hunted Shermans were themselves hunted by artillery, rockets, and encircling columns. Their final roars were drowned out by the thunder of advancing engines, thousands of them all painted with white stars. In the field where Charlie White 2 fell, new units passed weeks later. The burned-out hulls had been pushed aside, tracks half buried in the mud. One soldier carved a phrase on the Sherman's side with a bayonet. "For every Tiger, 10 of us. And we still win." That line would later appear in a division newsletter, a quiet testament to the faith that had carried them through. The moment of fear had passed. The tide had turned. The battlefield now belonged not to the biggest gun, but to the army that refused to stop moving, counting the cost. When the guns fell silent in Normandy, the numbers began to speak. Between June and August 1944, the U.S. First Army lost more than 2,500 tanks in combat and mechanical failure. Many of those losses came not from massed tank battles but from ambushes. A Tiger behind a hedgerow, a hidden 88mm gun, a single shot that turned 5 men into shadows. But statistics tell only half the truth. The battlefield itself became the real ledger. Fields scattered with burned-out hulls, crews buried beside their tanks, names scrawled on crosses made of salvaged wood. The German armored losses were far smaller in number but far heavier in weight. Each destroyed Tiger represented not just men, but months of labor, tons of steel, and the pride of an army. The Allies recovered dozens of disabled or abandoned Tigers during the breakout. Engineers and intelligence officers examined them with fascination and frustration. Reports from the U.S. Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence Section recorded exact figures. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100mm thick, its side armor 80mm, all hardened steel. The 75mm Sherman gun could only penetrate those plates at ranges under 100 meters, and only at a perfect angle. In contrast, the Tiger's 88mm could pierce the Sherman's armor at over 2,000 meters. The data was undeniable. Yet the conclusion wasn't despair. It was adaptation. The Tiger had been a tactical terror, not a strategic weapon. It could dominate a battlefield, but it could not change the war's direction. Germany's economy couldn't sustain it, nor could its commanders deploy it fast enough to counter the Allied tide. In the 8 weeks after D-Day, the U.S. Army had lost hundreds of tanks, but had landed thousands more. The voice in the archive. In the months after the breakout, Signal Corps analysts began to review hundreds of hours of recorded transmissions, fragments of radio chatter captured during Normandy. Among them was the brief transmission from Charlie White 2, now labeled as File 3A27 Normandy Sector, July 29, 1944. The log transcription reads simply, "Tiger sighted, 2 o'clock. Range 800. We're hit, Then silence. The file was classified at the time. Not for secrecy, but for sensitivity. Officers believed the recording might damage morale if released. But within the armored units, copies circulated quietly. Tankers listened to it in training tents, heads bowed, hearing in that broken voice the echo of their own vulnerability. Years later, historians at Fort Knox uncovered the original wire recording during an archival audit. The static was faint, the words distorted but unmistakable. It became one of the most haunting artifacts of the Normandy campaign, the human heartbeat beneath the noise of machines. Beyond the battlefield. After the collapse of the German lines in France, the surviving Tiger crews fell back across the Seine. Few of their tanks made it. Mechanical failures and air attacks destroyed most before they reached Germany. The 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion, which had once fielded 45 Tigers, ended the campaign with fewer than 10 operational vehicles. On the American side, the 3rd Armored Division pressed forward relentlessly, earning the nickname Spearhead. For every crew lost, replacements arrived, fresh from the States. But among the veterans, the psychological toll remained. The smell of burning fuel, the shockwave of a near miss, the sound of a shell striking armor, those sensations stayed long after victory was declared. In letters and memoirs, Sherman tankers rarely wrote about their triumphs. They wrote about the men beside them, the commander who refused to bail out, the loader who kept firing even as the turret burned, the driver who steered his crippled tank so others could escape. These acts of quiet heroism never made the headlines, but they defined the character of those who fought from inside the steel walls. The destruction of a single Tiger might have been a tactical victory. Surviving its onslaught was a moral one. By the time autumn came to France, the U.S. Army had faced, and outlasted, the most feared weapon of Hitler's armored forces. The myth of invincibility was shattered not by superior guns but by persistence. Still, the echoes of those early encounters lingered. In the debriefings of every tank battalion, commanders emphasized one phrase: remember the Tiger. It was both a warning and a legacy, the reminder that no machine, no matter how mighty, could stand forever against men who refused to stop advancing. And as the war moved eastward, toward Belgium and the Ardennes, the lessons of Normandy would be tested once more, in the freezing forests where tigers roared again during the last great gamble of the Third Reich. The end of the beast. By late 1944, the Tiger had lost its throne. In the aftermath of the Falaise Pocket, more than 100 German tanks were left smoldering in the Norman countryside. Among them were several Tigers, their massive hulls split open by internal detonations, tracks twisted like broken ribs. Allied soldiers inspected them not with fear, but with curiosity. The invincible machine had become a relic. Captured Tiger tanks were transported to England and the United States for testing. At Bovington Camp, British engineers ran exhaustive trials. Their conclusion: the Tiger was a magnificent weapon but utterly unsustainable. Each one required nearly 300,000 man-hours to build, compared to the Sherman's 40,000. Its fuel consumption, spare parts, and mechanical fragility made it the embodiment of a doomed philosophy: excellence without endurance. The Americans took the same lesson home. The new generation of tank designers at Aberdeen Proving Ground dissected the Tiger's remains with scientific fascination. They admired its gun, studied its optics, measured the density of its armor. Yet their verdict was clear. The future belonged not to monsters of steel but to adaptable, reliable machines, tanks that could move, communicate, and fight as part of a larger system. In that sense, the Tiger was already obsolete the moment it was born. It belonged to an age of duelists. The Allies had entered an age of networks. Doctrine transformed. The battles of Normandy rewrote the rulebook of armored warfare. American doctrine no longer saw tanks as independent gladiators but as nodes in a combined force and supported by infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft. Radios became as crucial as guns. Coordination became the true weapon. The Tiger had exposed the limits of armor thickness and gun caliber. No matter how strong the steel, there was always a bigger shell. What mattered now was speed, agility, and information. These lessons directly shaped the post-war tank lineage, from the M26 Pershing, born in the war's final months, to the M48 Patton and M60 of the Cold War. German engineers, too, carried their experience into the future. After the war, many worked for Allied powers under captured programs. Their knowledge helped create tanks like the Leopard and the M1 Abrams, machines that combined American practicality with German precision. The Tiger's shadow thus stretched far beyond its own battlefield death. The Human Debrief. 4. The soldiers who lived through it. The Tiger was more than an enemy. It was a teacher. Decades after the war, U.S. tank veterans still remembered their first encounters vividly. Interviews conducted by the Army Oral History Project in the 1960s record the same emotions: awe, terror, disbelief, and finally, grim determination. One veteran from the 4th Armored Division put it simply, "The Tiger taught us what fear really was. And once you've met fear like that, you don't fear anything else." On the German side, the Tiger crews who survived spoke with both pride and melancholy. They had wielded one of the greatest weapons of the era, yet they knew its greatness was wasted on a war already lost. Many described the loneliness of command inside the Tiger's turret, the crushing weight of responsibility, the isolation from infantry, the feeling of being hunted from the sky. By 1945, most surviving Tiger battalions were shells of their former strength, their machines destroyed or abandoned. The weapon that had once symbolized Nazi dominance ended as a monument to the futility of overconfidence. The echo that remained. When the war ended, the Signal Corps preserved thousands of radio transmissions for study. Most were routine, reports, coordinates, static. But the brief message from Charlie White 2 continued to circulate among tank schools and museums. In 1951, a copy was played during a lecture at Fort Knox titled, "Communications Under Fire." The instructor paused after the last word, "We're," and said quietly, "That's why we train." So the next voice doesn't end there. In that silence, cadets understood what no textbook could teach: that technology might define the means of war, but human courage defines its end. To this day, a transcript of the message is displayed at the Patton Armor Museum, mounted beside a piece of a destroyed Sherman hull. The caption reads simply, "Recovered transmission, Normandy, 1944. Last words of a crew who faced a Tiger." The Tiger became history. The voice became legend. From fear to legacy. The aftermath of those duels reshaped how armies thought about machines. It was no longer enough to build the strongest tank. One had to build a system that endured, supported, and protected the men inside it. In the end, the Tiger's destruction was not the triumph of metal over metal, but of men over myth. The myth that one machine could rule the battlefield forever. The myth that technology could conquer will. And as historians listened to that faint echo on magnetic tape and the last heartbeat of Charlie White 2, they realized something profound. The war of machines had always been, in truth, a war of men. The radio crackle fades, but the message lingers, carried through time, still whispering across archives and classrooms, still reminding those who listen that bravery can sound like static. Echoes of steel and silence. The battlefield is quiet now. The hedgerows of Normandy are green again, peaceful, sunlit, filled with the sound of wind instead of engines. Farmers plow the same fields where Tigers once lurked, and children play where Shermans burned. Time has reclaimed what war tried to erase. Yet beneath that soil lies history. Rusted tracks, shattered armor, fragments of radios. The remains of a generation that fought inside steel boxes, trusting machinery and each other against impossible odds. The confrontation between the Sherman and the Tiger was never simply about technology. It was about the limits of power, how human courage faces mechanical perfection and refuses to yield. The Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was born of arrogance, of a belief that superiority in steel could outweigh the endurance of men. The Sherman, humble and imperfect, was born of pragmatism, built not for glory but for persistence, and persistence won. In the end, it was not the thickest armor or the longest gun that defined victory. It was communication, adaptation, and the will to keep moving forward, even when the odds promised nothing but death. The radio message from Charlie White 2 still exists, faint, fragile, a heartbeat in static. It is more than an artifact. It is a mirror. In its broken words, we hear every soldier who ever faced something larger than himself and chose not to turn away. Wars change, weapons evolve, but the human element remains eternal. The quiet courage of ordinary men trapped inside extraordinary circumstances. That is the true legacy of Normandy, of the Shermans who kept advancing, of the Tigers that fell silent. Because history is not only written in victories, it is carved in the moments of fear that were met with resolve, in the last radio calls that no one answered, in the echoes that survive long after the guns go quiet. The war ended, the machines were scrapped, but the voice remains, whispering through time carried by static, reminding us of the fragile line between bravery and oblivion. It says only one thing: we were here,